All right, hello guys and gals. Today we're doing the muscles of the body. Um, Really, my main goal is you just to start to become familiar with the names of the muscles and where they are located. So, um, again, that is it. I'm not asking you to learn the origin, insertion, or innervation yet. That will take place in lab. But again, really need you to become familiar with the names of the muscles and where they're at. So we'll go through those as we kind of go along here. So we'll look at the major connective tissue elements, the size, shape, and fiber arrangement of skeletal muscles, and sort of how that helps determine the name. Discuss the attachments of muscles. Explain the functional classification of muscles based on movement patterns. Describe how the lever systems work, and three classes of levers, and how that it works within the body. Identify 6 features that may be used to name a muscle. We're going to identify axial muscles and their point of attachment and their function in the following areas, and that includes the face, the mastication, the head, the thorax, the abdominal walls, some of the back ones, and some of the pelvic floor. So the body has about 600 plus muscles, and give or take. We do differ depending on the individual. It's not a hard, fast number because some numbers, and we'll kind of point out some of them, some people have some muscles and some people don't. It's just how it happened as we sort of continue to evolve through time. So the muscles make up about 40% of our body weight. So again, most of what you weigh is, or half of it about, is muscle, depending on your build. The rest, then we have bones and other organs. And again, probably main thing that muscles do is they really do, again, as they describe here, fill out the form and contour of the body, so it gives us shape. But really, it's what helps us move, both standing up and as well as move those bony levers, and so that we can move around the world and do what we do. So again, they play an important role there. They also do some other minor things we'll see when we start doing actual muscle tissue, such as creating body heat and things like that. Well, I guess that's not necessarily minor all the time, but it's something that, again, we just mostly think of muscles as, again, giving us form and movement, but again, they do play some other roles that we'll talk about later. So there are some connective tissues, or some different layers to the muscles, and so I'm actually going to skip forward a couple here. So the 3 layers are the endosteum, periosteum, and epimysium. Excuse me, I said that right. So the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium. So those are really our 3 layers. And so if we look at this picture, which is a couple down, we have, again, the myofibrils are sort of, we'll see when we do the muscles, are the actual what are doing the contractions, and they're actually within the muscle cell. And so then the muscle cells form these long chains, and those are called fibrils. And then those fibrils are then surrounded by a muscle, or excuse me, the sarcolemma. Wow, my brain is in somewhere else. Which is really just another name for the cell membrane. Then that is then formed into fascicles here that we can see. So this is the fascicle, and the fascicles are then wrapped in the endomysium. So basically, really, what you have, these long chains of muscle cells wrapped together into fascicles by the endomysium. That fascicle is then wrapped by the perimysium to form sort of, again, probably more proper fascicles, or to help bind all those together. And then that is wrapped up in the epimysium. And the epimysium becomes part and parcel of the fascia that is surrounding the muscle, and then actually then goes in and forms the tendinous structure. And that tendinous structure then is embedded within the periosteum, which is a covering of the bone. And then it goes into the first kind of layer of the bone that helps anchor that bone, or that tendon to the bone. So let me back up here. So the size of muscles can be very small to very large. So you have really tiny ones in our ear that are skeletal muscle, that attach to some of the middle ear bones that help quiet so if you hear something really loud or shocking, these are sort of help kind of protect your ear. Then you have, again, very large ones like your buttock muscles or your hamstrings or your quads. And actually your quads are made up of 4 muscles, but you sort of get the idea. Again, the shape can be varied from very broad, flat, like your lats, very narrow. Some of the ones in your hand or upper extremity are very narrow. You have long ones and tapered and short ones. So again, you get that idea. We'll look at some different ones. The fiber arrangement can vary as well. So sometimes all the fibers are very parallel along a long axis. Sometimes they converge along a narrow attachment. And we'll look at that here in a bit too. So again, they're going to form all sorts of different things. So then we have this one. So then we jump to this one. Another thing to think about is that we're really talking about a very layered thing. So this is your upper arm. So we got the bicep on the very top. Then we have the brachialis, which is another muscle underneath. Then we have the heads of the tricep that sort of form here, the medial, lateral, and long. And then within there, we also have the what we call sometimes the vein, artery, and nerve. And then some any other vascular kind of stuff that needs to happen. So again, we're very layered. So again, that's another thing that sometimes people struggle with, is just the fact that we have these multiple layers of muscles. So again, it's not as simple as just one bone or one muscle on top of a bone. A lot of times there may be a muscle on top of a muscle on top of a bone. So again, sort of some of the shapes we see. So some long, sort of parallel, that sort of strap-like muscles is a sartorius. This is not a muscle we really talk about. This is part of your thigh musculature, and it runs from your anterior superior iliac spine down to the medial area of the tibia, and it's just as long. It's also known as the Taylor's muscle because it sort of helps externally rotate and flex the knee, sort of like if you were going to kind of put your right ankle on your left knee, that sort of position that tailors used to sit in when they were sewing. Other ones we see, this is rectus abdominis. This is your abdominal muscles. Again, very long parallel with a lot of ligamentous structures inside. Converging, this is a pec major, so this chest muscle goes from a very broad attachment and it narrows down and it converges onto a fairly narrow attachment. It's not quite as narrow as they make it look here, but it is fairly narrow. So it does that. Pinnate basically means, think of it like a feather. So basically you have one kind of tendinous, and then in this case, this unipinnate, all the fibers are sort of going to have this kind of direction going down into this kind of ligamentous tissue. Bipinnate, this is rectus femoris, is part of your, so flexor pollicis longus is actually a thumb muscle that goes from your forearm. This rectus femoris is a part of the quads that we will learn. We're not going to have you necessarily learn the flexor pollicis longus, but you can kind of see that this has this kind of oblique fiber direction, so it packs in a lot more muscle fibers in that area, but they all come down to attach, and so they equally pull on this tendon here. Multipinnate, this is your deltoid, which is actually made up of 3 separate parts. So you have your anterior, middle, and posterior deltoid, and each of those really kind of falls in sort of this bipinnate, that they sort of form this kind of orientation, but then all converge onto this one tendon in your deltoid. Fusiform are a kind of an odd one. This is a brachioradialis. We'll learn it's a forearm muscle. And basically what you do is you start with kind of a very narrow attachment, and the belly of the muscle actually is fairly broad, but then that again sort of narrows down into a kind of a more singular sort of narrow attachment. So they call that a fusiform. Spiral, this is your lats, latissimus dorsi. What they talk about here is a spiral. So actually what happens is this attaches onto this, what we kind of call a broad aponeurosis. So this is kind of like a tendon, but it's very flat and long and kind of large. As it comes up, it's going to go through under your armpit, and as it does, it actually twists. So then it attaches onto your humerus on the proximal end. And so, the important part is that twisting that it does. It kind of has a spiraling twisting. And then last but not least, we have circular. So circular, again, this is an eye muscle that we don't really learn about. We are going to talk about throughout this course about other sphincters. So things that close off tubes that make us. So again, we have some sphincters in our throat, and we have the big sphincter as our waste material exits our body. But so that's usually, there's some skeletal muscle to that, and sometimes there's some smooth muscle that also kind of mirrors it. And so the skeletal muscle always means that we really have some sort of volitional control in general. Smooth muscle we don't have necessarily a lot of control over. All right. So we've already sort of talked about this. Muscles have origins and insertions, and in general, the origin is a point of attachment that does not move when the muscle contracts. In general, insertions are a point of attachment that move when the muscle contracts, which I kind of find interesting, but we'll talk about how this is not always necessarily true, so this confuse some people. But again, we'll talk about it in sort of the next slide. The other thing we want to think about when you're trying to decide what origin and insertion is, origins tend to either be more proximal or more towards the midline. So a lot of the muscles that attach from the spine to the shoulder blade, their origin is going to be the spine, and their insertion is going to be into the shoulder blade. Things that attach the shoulder blade to the shoulder, from the shoulder blade origin, somewhere in the shoulder, insertion. But then you have some muscles like the biceps, which again attach above at the shoulder area and then distally sort of across as the elbow. So that's the insertion. So that's the general rule. Now there are exceptions to the rule, like most things, and so we'll see when we start looking at some of the trunk musculature, particularly the abdominals, the obliques. We run into sometimes the origin is actually more distal and it moves more kind of proximal. And then we will also see in some of the lumbar muscles that we'll kind of talk about briefly. In general, again, we'll talk about the lumbar muscles as a group, but in general, their origin is actually more towards the pelvis, and then as they move superior, it's more distal. And how that comes about is the fact that really you want to look at probably in some ways, where is it going to be most stable and where you're going to have movement. So in the case of like the pelvis and the back muscles, the pelvis is what's stable and it's moving the trunk around that, or over that. So that's why the origin insertions can probably be looked at as a bit different. But again, as we move through each muscle, we'll be focusing on the origin and insertion.